Our Torah reading this morning for the second day of Rosh Hashanah is the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. I have to admit that the story about God's call to Abraham to sacrifice his son has always bothered me until this summer when there was no camp and my kids were home every single day. Suddenly, child sacrifice didn't seem like such a crazy idea. But when we read this story, we often focus on God's first command to Abraham, which is to sacrifice his son. We rightly wonder, how could God ask Abraham to do such a thing? Why doesn't Abraham argue? And why didn't Isaac say anything? All difficult questions. Saadia Gaon, the great early 10th century sage, asks a different question, however. He calls our attention not to God's first command, but to God's second command. In verse 2 of the story, God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And then in verse 12, God commands Abraham through an angel not to sacrifice Isaac. Why is this, Saadia wonders? Why would God give conflicting commands? Well, we could say that there's no conflict at all. Rather, God is satisfied that Abraham passed the test, so no need for innocent bloodshed. Isaac is unharmed, Abraham is faithful, story over. But is this really the lesson of the Akedah? In his new book, Unbinding Isaac, Professor Aaron Kohler shows that seeing this story as a lesson about the importance of faith over ethics only gained prominence in the 19th century. It was Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, in one of his early essays entitled Fear and Trembling, who first made this argument. Professor Yeshayahu Leibowitz and Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik reinforced this view in the 20th century, as it resonated with them after the Holocaust. But not everyone was convinced that the meaning of the Akedah is the primacy of faith over all else. Emmanuel Levinas was also a Holocaust survivor and a French philosopher. He thought that this approach ignored the second half of the text. Kierkegaard only focused on God's first command to sacrifice Isaac, but ignored God's second command not to go through with it. Perhaps, Levinas wrote, Abraham's attentiveness to the voice that led him back to the ethical order in forbidding him to sacrifice his son is the highest point in this drama. He goes on, that Abraham obeyed the first voice is astonishing, but that he had sufficient distance with respect to that obedience to obey the second voice, that is essential. For Levinas, the lesson of the Akedah is that Abraham was able to hear the second voice and to change course. Take a moment and think about this. Abraham believes that God told him to sacrifice his son. He takes the boy and his servants on a 3-day journey to Mount Moriah. They hike to the top of the mountain. Abraham binds Isaac and seems ready to fulfill God's command. When you've gone to such great lengths, it's hard to change course. It's hard to listen to a different voice. Yet that's exactly what Abraham is able to do. Even after all he did for that moment, Abraham still hears God's second command. Do not lay a finger on the boy. And though it contradicts the first, Abraham obeys God, and Isaac is saved. Read this way, the Akedah challenges us in 2 ways. First, to listen to contradictory voices. How many times have you refused to listen to someone who disagrees with you, who disputes your worldview, who tells you when you're wrong? We've all done that this year. And with a contentious election around the corner, it will only get worse. Abraham's example teaches us that no matter how far we've gone, we still should maintain the capacity to listen to other voices, to entertain the possibility that we misunderstood, or acknowledge that circumstances have changed and we need to change with them. Isaac was saved because Abraham is still able to listen. Are we? Second, the Akedah challenges us to be able to change. Even after we have set out on a course of action, even in front of the people we love, sometimes we have to change. We have to adjust our beliefs, our actions, or our approach. Pride, arrogance, or tunnel vision could have prevented Abraham from changing his mind. Instead, Abraham's humility and his dedication to God allowed him to listen and to change his plans. This is what makes the second command so essential. It saved Abraham, and it can save us from ourselves. What do you think about Levinas's interpretation of the Akedah? How do you reconcile God's two contradictory calls in this story? This afternoon at 2 o'clock on Zoom, we will continue to explore these interpretations of the Akedah. I hope that you will join me then. For now, you can continue to consider this story and its meaning as we read excerpts from it. It can be found on page 220 in your Machzorim. Gavin Gershon, Ilana Shanes, Hannah Pollack, Alyssa London, and Ben Bannett will be our Torah readers. First, we'll recite the blessing over Torah study together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'tzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.